Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz is one of the most prominent and controversial figures of the 20th century. Born on August 13, 1926, on a farm in the province of Oriente in Cuba, he grew up in a wealthy family of landowners, but his life eventually became a symbol of the struggle against inequality, imperialism, and the capitalist system. The son of a Spanish immigrant, Fidel was educated in Jesuit schools and later entered the University of Havana, where he studied law. It was there that he became interested in politics, joining student movements that opposed corruption and dictatorship. In the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by Fulgencio Batista, a dictator who came to power with the support of the United States and whose rule was characterized by corruption, economic inequality, and dependence on American interests. For the young Fidel, who was already fascinated by the ideas of socialism and nationalism, this was an impetus for action. In 1953, he led an unsuccessful attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, an attempted uprising against Batista that ended in his arrest. During his trial, Fidel delivered his famous "History Will Vindicate Me" speech, where he outlined his vision of a just Cuba. This moment was the beginning of his legend. After his imprisonment and subsequent exile in Mexico, Fidel did not give up. There he met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine revolutionary who became his close associate. In 1956, Castro and a small group of rebels landed in Cuba on the yacht Grama, launching a guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. This struggle lasted 2 years and ended in triumph. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and Fidel Castro entered Havana as the leader of the revolution. After coming to power, Castro radically changed Cuba. He nationalized industry, confiscated land from American companies, introduced free education and healthcare, but at the same time established a one-party system, suppressing political opposition. His alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, including the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962, led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when the world was on the brink of nuclear war. For some, Fidel became a symbol of the struggle against imperialism. For others, a dictator who brought isolation and economic hardship to Cuba. Castro ruled Cuba for almost half a century, until 2008, when he handed over power to his brother Raul due to poor health. His death in 2016 ended an era, but left behind a legacy that is still hotly debated. Under his leadership, Cuba became a unique example of a socialist experiment in the Western Hemisphere, but at the same time a country that suffered from U.S. economic sanctions, political repression, and mass immigration. Fidel Castro was a charismatic leader with an unwavering belief in his ideals. His life is a story about how one man can change the fate of a nation, but also about how one man's choices can lead to a polarized society. But what if Fidel Castro had never come to power? What if the 1959 revolution had never happened and Cuba had taken a different path? Let's imagine an alternative history where Castro's absence opens the door to a very different Cuba, perhaps richer, perhaps more democratic, but certainly different. Let's dive into this fantasy and explore what Cuba might look like without Fidel. Let's imagine a world where Fidel Castro did not become the leader of the revolution. Suppose that in 1953, the attack on the Moncada barracks not only failed, but also completely demoralized the young lawyer. Perhaps he was arrested, but instead of a heroic speech and amnesty 2 years later, he remained in prison or was even executed by Batista's order. Without a charismatic leader, the July 26 movement disintegrates, and the guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra never begins. Che Guevara, not having found an ally in Castro, stays in Mexico or returns to Argentina without ever setting foot on Cuban soil. What happens to Cuba in this scenario? In the 1950s, Fulgencio Batista remained in power longer than in historical reality. His regime, though corrupt and authoritarian, is supported by the United States as a bastion against communism in the Caribbean. Without revolutionary pressure from Castro, Batista is not forced to flee in 1959. Instead, he maintains control, relying on the army and American investment. Cuba remains a plaything of American capital. Havana's casinos are booming, the Hilton and Tropicana hotels are expanding, and the sugar industry is generating steady income. But this stability is deceptive. Inequality between the wealthy elites and the poor peasants is growing, causing discontent. By the mid-1960s, pressure on Batista was mounting, not through socialist revolution, but through democratic movements. Without Castro to direct the protest in a communist direction, the opposition is formed around liberal and pro-American leaders. Let's imagine that someone like Carlos Socaras, the former president overthrown by Batista in 1952, comes to power and returns from exile with the support of the United States. In 1965, Batista was forced to resign under the pressure of mass protests and diplomatic pressure from Washington. A democratic government is established in Cuba, promising reforms but maintaining close ties with the United States. Without nationalization and a break with the United States, Cuba will not be subject to an economic embargo. American companies continue to invest in the island. Sugar, tobacco, and tourism become the basis of economic growth. Havana turns into the Caribbean equivalent of Miami, a glittering city with skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and a vibrant nightlife. In the 1970s, Cuba became a popular destination for American tourists, and its beaches, Varadero, Cayo Coco, attracted millions of visitors every year. Instead of isolation, the island integrates into the Western world, becoming the economic center of the region. Politically, Cuba is developing as a democracy, albeit an imperfect one. Governments change through elections, but corruption remains a problem, as it was in many Latin American countries at the time. Without Castro's socialist ideology, there are no mass repressions or political imprisonments, but inequality persists. The rich get richer, while poor peasants receive only crumbs from the economic boom. Education and healthcare are developing more slowly than under Castro, as there are no centralized social programs. Private American foundations are opening schools and clinics, but access to them is limited for the majority of the population. Internationally, Cuba avoids confrontation with the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 does not occur because there is no alliance with the USSR. Instead, the island becomes a strategic ally of Washington in the fight against communism in Latin America. In the 1980s, when uprisings erupted in the region, from Nicaragua to El Salvador, Cuba played the role of a showcase of democracy, contrasting with socialist regimes. The U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay is expanding, becoming a symbol of a strong partnership. Economically, Cuba makes significant progress by the end of the 20th century. In the 1990s, as the world economy globalizes, the island attracts not only tourists, but also technology companies. Havana became a center for offshore banking services, and the port of Mariel became an important hub for trade between the Americas. Without embargo and isolation, Cuba integrates into NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, gaining access to the U.S. and Canadian markets. The sugar monoculture is giving way to a diversified economy. Pharmaceuticals, light industry, and even the film industry, due to its proximity to Hollywood, are becoming new sources of income. Cuba retains its cultural flavor, but under strong American influence. Instead of revolutionary anthems, jazz clubs and pop music with salsa elements become popular. In the 2000s, Cuban artists such as the imaginary Juan Perez, the star of Latin pop, conquered the world charts. Havana's streets are filled with modern cars rather than old 1950s Chevys, although the vintage cars are preserved as a tourist attraction. But is everything so perfect? There is a dark side to this alternative Cuba. Without Castro's socialist reforms, the huge gap between the rich and the poor leads to social protests. In the 2010s, the imaginary Havana riots become a response to economic inequality. Poor neighborhoods demand reforms, and the government, dependent on foreign capital, hesitates between repression and concessions. Environmental problems are also becoming more acute. Mass tourism and industry are damaging the island's nature, and the Varadero coral reefs are gradually disappearing. By 2025, in this reality, Cuba will be a rich but polarized country. Its GDP per capita exceeds many Latin American countries, but social tensions remain. The political system is evolving toward greater openness, but the oligarchy remains in control. The island is known in the world as the Caribbean Pearl, a place where the American dream and the Cuban soul mingle, but where the struggle for justice has never ended. So, what do we see in this alternative history? Without Fidel Castro, Cuba could have avoided isolation, the economic embargo, and the socialist experiment, becoming a prosperous capitalist center of the Caribbean. Havana would have become a metropolis, tourism and trade would have provided wealth, and the alliance with the United States would have provided stability in the Cold War. However, the price of this was the persistence of inequality. the slow development of social systems, and the loss of the unique revolutionary spirit that made Cuba a symbol of resistance. In this reality, Cuba would be different, perhaps richer, but would it be happier? This question remains open. An alternative history shows how one man changed the fate of a nation and reminds us that every choice has its consequences.